So dear students, today we are going to discuss about micturition reflex. Now what is micturition reflex? It is the reflex contraction of detrusor muscle, which is the muscle of bladder and which is unitary muscle. Reflex contraction of the detrusor muscle in response to stretch stimulus, and stretch is initiated by filling of bladder. Now here there is a role of sympathetic as well as parasympathetic fibers, which is coordinated and controlled and regulated by the pontine micturition center. So let's get into the lecture. Now let's say suppose this is the midbrain. Now we all know that there are three parts of the brainstem: midbrain, pons and medulla. Midbrain, pons and medulla. And medulla continue as spinal cord. Now within pons there are micturition centers, and these micturition centers are called pontine micturition center. Now medulla continue as spinal cord. Now these are two section of the spinal cord. One is at the level of L1, 2 and 3, and another is at the level of sacral segment S2, 3 and 4. Okay, one spinal cord section is at the level of L1, 2 and 3, and another is S2, 3 and 4. Now this is bladder. The muscle of bladder is called detrusor muscle, which is unitary muscle. Why it is called unitary muscle? Because when one unit of detrusor muscle is contracted, whole muscle will contract, because they are connected through gap junctions. So when one cell is stimulated, action potential run throughout the whole muscle. Now at the lower part of the bladder, where there is triangular shape, this triangular shape within bladder is called trigone. And what is the clinical importance? Trigone is richly innervated by sensory nerve endings. Sensory nerve endings. At the lower part of the trigone, there is one sphincter, and this sphincter is called internal urethral sphincter. Whereas below internal urethral sphincter, there is another sphincter, and which is called external urethral sphincter. Now when bladder is filled with urine, that urine trickle down toward the trigone. So from the trigone, through the sensory nerve endings, sensation of the filling, which create the urge to micturate, and that sensation is carried through these sensory fibers. This sensory fiber enter through posterior gray horn at the level of sacral segment, and they enter through posterior gray horn, and then they ascend through the posterior column of spinal cord, ascend upward. Now while entering this sensory nerve fiber through the posterior gray horn, They also stimulate or communicate with intermediolateral horn. Intermediolateral horn, and through the intermediolateral horn of the sacral segment, preganglionic parasympathetic fibers are coming out. And these parasympathetic efferent fibers, they innervate detrusor muscle as well as internal urethral sphincter. Now, in the same way, this side, the fibers that are coming out, they supply detrusor muscle as well as internal urethral sphincter. So when bladder is filled with urine and urine gets trickled down toward the trigone, sensation from the sensory nerve endings carried through sensory fibers which enter into the spinal sacral segment of the spinal cord and ascend upward through the posterior column and ascend upward all the way through medulla, pons and midbrain and gets end up in sensory cortex. So this sensation is carried to the sensory cortex that gives the feeling of micturition, or that create an urge of micturition, and that is also called conscious awareness of bladder filling. Now, intermediolateral horn of the lumbar segment of the spinal cord. The fibers that are coming out from this intermediolateral horn, they are sympathetic fibers. These blue fibers are parasympathetic fibers, whereas these red fibers which are coming out from lumbar segment, they are sympathetic fibers. These sympathetic efferent fibers also innervate detrusor as well as internal urethral sphincter. So red fibers are sympathetic fibers and these blue fibers are parasympathetic fibers. Now if we stimulate these sympathetic fibers at the nerve ending, they release neurotransmitter which is called adrenaline. This adrenaline act on beta 2 receptor present on detrusor muscle and cause the detrusor muscle relaxation. And this adrenaline at the internal urethral sphincter, they bind to alpha 1A receptor which cause tightening or constriction of internal urethral sphincter. So sympathetic fibers is causing detrusor relaxation and tightening or the constriction of internal urethral sphincter. Whereas parasympathetic fibers, when we stimulate parasympathetic fibers, that cause detrusor muscle contraction and relaxation of external internal urethral sphincter, that eventually leads to the voiding of the urine. But now how this sympathetic and parasympathetic action is coordinated? So this pontine micturition centers, the descending fibers from these pontine micturition centers, when they descend downward, they inhibit sympathetic fibers and stimulate parasympathetic fibers. And another fibers that are coming from the anterior gray horn. These are the somatic fibers, and these somatic fibers innervate external urethral sphincter. This external urethral sphincter is made up of skeletal muscles, so it has a voluntary control. This the descending fibers that are coming off from the pontine micturition center, they inhibit sympathetic fiber, stimulate parasympathetic, and they also stimulate somatic fibers. So when we stimulate pontine micturition center, that leads to contraction of the bladder, relaxation of the internal urethral sphincter through the parasympathetic stimulation, as well as relaxation of external urethral sphincter. Now, when bladder is filled, but the situation or the place where you are, which is not socially acceptable to void the urine, our higher center, cerebral cortex, cerebral cortex keep this pontine micturition center inhibited. So what will happen when situation is not socially appropriate to void the urine, or higher consciousness or higher center, suprapontine centers that keep inhibited these pontine micturition centers and keep the internal urethral sphincter as well as external urethral sphincter constricted to prevent the voiding. But as soon as you reach to the appropriate place, like washroom is a socially acceptable appropriate place to void the urine, this inhibition is relieved. This is also called disinhibition. This inhibition will be relieved, or it is called disinhibition, that leads to the stimulation of the parasympathetic fibers and inhibition of sympathetic fiber. Under inappropriate place, pontine micturition centers, the inhibition that are coming, which will be relieved, that is called disinhibition. And under inappropriate places, these pontine micturition centers gets or kept inhibited to prevent voiding. So this pontine micturition center and suprapontine centers, they coordinate the activity of sympathetic fibers and parasympathetic fibers to storage of the urine and voiding of the urine when appropriate place is reached. So that is how the reflex contraction occur. Reflex contraction of the bladder occur at the appropriate place to void the urine. Right. So this is the basic physiology of the micturition. In next lecture, we will study about the applied aspect of micturition. What happen when there is damage to any of these fibers, somatic fibers or parasympathetic fibers or sensory fibers, or sometimes there is a mixed pathology where all the fibers are affected. Thank you.